You ever just find yourself like totally zoning out and instead of thinking in words, you're thinking in pictures?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
I feel like those little mental movies, those images, they hold so much, you know? Like emotions we don't even have words for.
Definitely. There's so much there.
So today, we're diving into that, like really exploring that whole inner world of images.
Sounds like a fascinating journey.
It is. And we've got like the perfect guide for this. We're going to be looking at the psychocybernetic model of art therapy. And this was developed by Dr. Aina O. Nucho. She's amazing. She's a professor emerita at the University of Maryland,
Wow.
but she's got this truly global background, like roots in Latvia and Germany. She's studied at Bryn Mawr, and her whole career has been like dedicated to understanding the power of imagery, and how our minds use it.
That's really interesting. So with this psychocybernetic thing, it sounds a little bit, I don't know, futuristic or something. But what's the main idea here about how these images in our minds actually work?
Right, it's not robots or anything. So basically, the model, it says that our minds use images, right? As like a main way of processing our experiences.
Okay.
Think of it like when you have a feeling that's so strong or a memory that's so vivid, but you're like, I can't even put this into words. It's
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And the model suggests that those images, they're not just random. They actually hold important information. It's almost like a visual language, that we can learn to actually understand.
Wow. So there's a message in those pictures.
Exactly.
Cool.
So our mission today is like a big one. We're really going to try to grasp those core principles of this psychocybernetic model and see if by focusing on these inner pictures, we can unlock some deeper insights about ourselves.
Ooh, unlocking secrets. I like that.
Right. So why is imagery so important anyway? Dr. Nucho's work talks about this neglected world of imagery. What exactly has been neglected, you think?
Well, what's fascinating is that the book actually argues that in Western culture, historically, we've put so much emphasis on verbal stuff, right? Even physical information.
Right. Put it into words.
Exactly. We analyze words like crazy. We track our heart rates and all that. But the rich information that's actually in our mental pictures, that's been kind of pushed aside. It hasn't gotten the same attention.
It's true. Like, how many times have you heard you need to verbalize your feelings?
Oh, yeah.
So how does this model sort of bridge that gap? How do we go from these unspoken images to actually understanding them in a way that maybe involves words?
Okay, this is where it gets super interesting. Well, the model actually builds on some older ideas. Like, for example, Freud's concept of primary process thought. That's like, think about dreams, fantasies, that world of images, versus secondary process thought, which is all about logic and reason, the way we usually try to make sense of things.
Right, like the step-by-step.
Exactly. And for a long time, people thought that primary process thought, all that imagery stuff, was like a less developed way of thinking, like something you grow out of. But more recently, thinkers like Arrietty have argued that it's not about outgrowing it at all. It's about learning to integrate it with our logical thinking, actually using both together to boost our creativity. And that's what the psychocybernetic model is all about, finding a way to tap into that power of imagery and make it work for us.
So it's not about ditching logic. It's about adding this whole other layer of understanding through pictures.
Exactly. It's like adding color to a black and white sketch.
I like that, yeah. And what's really interesting is that to help explain how this integration works, the model actually uses ideas from cybernetics. And, when you hear cybernetics, you probably think of like robots and AI, but it's much broader than that.
Oh, right.
At its heart, it's about understanding how information flows, like in any system, and how systems regulate themselves to reach goals.
Goals. Okay.
So it's like you can think of your mind as this incredibly complex system that's always taking in information, trying to stay balanced, whether you're consciously aware of it or not.
Right.
And then you've got general system theory, which comes in and provides this bigger picture view, emphasizing how everything's connected, not just separate parts. So the psychocybernetic model sees our mental imagery as this vital part of that interconnected system. It influences and is influenced by our thoughts, emotions, even our bodies.
So cybernetics is about information flow and control in all these connected systems.
Yes, okay.
Got it. But how does that specifically apply to our minds, to the psycho part of it?
Well, one of the key ideas in cybernetics is negative feedback. So think about your thermostat at home.
Okay.
When it gets too cold, it tells the heater to turn on, right? And when it reaches the right temperature, it's like, okay, heater, you can chill out now.
Right. It shuts off.
Exactly. So it's like a self-regulating loop. And the psychocybernetic model basically applies the same concept to how our minds work. Our images, feelings, thoughts, they're all connected in these feedback loops, constantly interacting to maintain some sort of equilibrium, like a mental thermostat. So psychocybernetics, it's all about understanding the mind as this self-regulating system, and imagery plays a huge role in all of that.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So if these images are part of this self-regulation thing, how do they actually help us make sense of the world around us?
Well, images, they're really powerful tools for understanding because they let us compare new experiences to things we already know.
Okay.
It's almost like your brain has this visual filing system.
Yeah.
Dr. Nucho talks about the difference between perception and cognition.
Yep.
So perception is like recognizing something immediately right in front of you, like the basic dictionary definition of something.
Right.
So you see a woman and you recognize her as mother, female parent.
Right.
Cognition goes deeper. It brings in all those associations, all those feelings based on your past experiences. So mother becomes like care, tenderness, maybe even love. Images are packed with those deeper meanings.
They're layered.
Exactly. So it's like our internal library of images helps us add those layers of meaning to everything we experience.
I see. That's really cool. But are all images the same? Like, are there different kinds?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
The model talks about reproductive imagery, which is basically your memory of visual experiences. Like, remember that time you went to the beach? You can probably picture it, right?
Yeah.
And then there's productive or imagination imagery, which is when you take bits and pieces from different memories and combine them to create something new.
Oh, like a collage.
Exactly. And it's really fascinating because a neuroscientist named Michael Gazzaniga, he actually suggests that even when we're just remembering something, it's not like replaying a video. It's an active process of reconstruction in our brains.
So our memories are actually creative too.
That's the idea. It's wild, right?
It is.
And both memory and imagination, they're shaped by what we pay attention to, what we choose to remember, and even forget. So they're both creative products in a way.
That's a really different way of thinking about memory.
It is. And what's also really interesting is that we all have different preferences for how we experience these images. Some people, they're super visual. They think and remember primarily in pictures.
Like me, I think.
Right. And then others are more haptic, which means they rely more on touch and physical sensations to make sense of things.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And there was this researcher, Victor Lowenfeld, and he actually found that there's a large group of people who are visual, a smaller group who are haptic, and then a lot of us who are kind of a mix of both.
So that could even influence what kind of art we like or make.
Totally. Someone who's a visual thinker might be really drawn to painting, while someone more tuned into touch might prefer sculpting or working with clay.
That makes sense, yeah.
And this whole idea of preferred ways of experiencing images, it plays into how we understand abstract ideas too. Like we use metaphors all the time, right?
Oh, yeah.
Finding a concrete image to represent something you can't actually see or touch. Our minds, they have this incredible ability to take a vague notion and make it into something tangible, something real.
Right.
William James, he observed this too, and he talked about how our thoughts often grab onto something concrete, like a word or a gesture, to feel more real. It's like this act of giving form to an image, and that's often the very step from a picture in our mind to a symbol.
So by picturing it, we actually make it more real for ourselves.
Exactly. And this becomes super important when we're talking about emotions.
Right.
Because emotions, they're complex, they're always changing. And a philosopher named Suzanne Langer, she argued that language, as precise as it can be, just isn't quite equipped to capture the full experience of our emotions.
I can't fully express them.
Exactly. And she suggested that nonverbal forms like visual art, music, they're much better at conveying those subtle, intricate feelings.
Because they're not limited by words.
Right. Langer said it perfectly. Images are our readiest instruments for abstracting concepts from the tumbling stream of actual impressions. They are our spontaneous embodiments of general ideas.
Yeah.
It's like art can sometimes say what words just can't.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It makes you realize how much we express without even realizing it.
Exactly. And to get a better handle on how our minds handle all these different types of information, the model talks about the roles of our brain hemispheres.
Oh, right. The left brain and right brain.
Yeah. We've all heard about the left brain being more logical and verbal, the right brain more visual and intuitive. But it's really important to remember they work together.
They're a team.
Exactly. It's not about one being dominant. Donald Norman, he really emphasized how important it is for them to be flexible and communicate with each other, both for understanding and for creativity.
So it's like the magic happens when they cooperate.
Totally. And it's important to remember that these images we're talking about, they're not just sitting passively in our minds, they're active.
Hmm.
Dr. Nucho, she really stresses that images, they both consume and produce energy, and they can actually affect our physical state.
Really?
Yeah. It's not just that a happy thought makes you feel good. The happy image itself can trigger physical changes in your body, like with your heart rate, your blood pressure, all that stuff. And it's different from the changes that would happen if you pictured something sad or scary. And this whole mind-body connection, that's what biofeedback techniques are based on.
It's fascinating how much our minds and bodies are connected.
Isn't it?
It is.
And this whole idea of images being active, it really supports the idea that we can't truly understand the mind by just breaking it down into parts, which was a common approach in the past.
Like taking it apart and examining each piece.
Right. And the psychocybernetic model, it advocates for a systems approach to psychology, like understanding how everything's connected and works together. There's a great analogy that Robert Marx used, where he said trying to understand an elephant by only looking at its toe is totally missing the point.
Oh, yeah, you missed the
Right.
big picture.
Exactly. William James, he also criticized that fragmented view, comparing consciousness to a river. It's a constant flow, not just a bunch of separate drops. And he saw mental images as part of this flow, surrounded by all these associations and feelings that give them their meaning.
So it's all interconnected.
It is. And within this framework, expressive therapies, which encourage those nonverbal ways of thinking and feeling, they become super important.
Right.
And among these, art therapy holds a really special place in the psychocybernetic model. So while it took some time for the visual arts to be integrated into those helping professions, like therapy and counseling, it's a really powerful way to access these deeper levels of understanding.
So let's talk about that history.
Yeah.
Where did this whole idea of using art as a therapeutic tool even come from?
Well, it might surprise you to know that the idea that art has healing power, it's been around for a very long time, like way back to ancient Greece.
Wow.
Plato, in his Republic, he actually argued that music, with its harmony and rhythm, it could bring balance to the soul. And he saw it as complementing physical exercise to create a well-rounded individual.
So even back then, they recognized the power of art to affect our inner state.
Totally. And later on, you had those progressive education movements that really emphasized self-expression as being beneficial in itself. And they were heavily influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He believed that people are inherently good and that natural expression was really important.
So that idea that art is good for you has been around for ages. But how did it actually become like official art therapy?
Right, that's a good question. And that's where specific individuals really made a difference.
Right.
Carl Jung, for example, he actually used mandala drawings, those circular designs, as symbols of wholeness and integration in his own self-exploration.
Interesting.
But a key moment for him, and really for the field as a whole, was in 1928 with a patient he called Miss X. So she was visiting her mother's homeland, and she suddenly felt this urge to paint landscapes which she'd never done before.
Wow.
And these watercolors, they brought her this deep sense of peace and renewed energy. And Jung, he saw this as this spontaneous form of what he called active imagination and considered it a fundamental part of art therapy.
So that idea of really engaging with your inner imagery through art was like a big breakthrough.
Totally. And then you have Adrian Hill. He was another important figure. He worked with soldiers who were recovering from injuries during World War II.
Oh, wow.
And he noticed that drawing really helped ease their recovery, gave them a sense of purpose and creation amidst all the trauma. He was really passionate about the healing power of art for people who had been through so much.
Yeah, especially in that context.
Definitely. So from personal exploration to those wartime experiences, the seeds of art therapy were being planted. But who really brought it all together as an actual field?
It seems like it had all these pieces, but someone had to unify it.
Right. And Margaret Numberg, she's the one who's often credited with that. Her work was really the start of art therapy as a recognized discipline. And her approach was this really interesting blend of progressive education principles, Jungian psychology, and psychoanalytic theory. She had these experiences as a child of feeling restricted, And in her early career, she taught at the Henry Street Settlement and even founded the Walden School.
Oh, wow.
And she really emphasized the importance of free artistic expression there. She was also part of these really influential literary and artistic circles.
So she was connected to the art world.
Oh, yeah, and exposed to all sorts of things like European modernist art. And she actually collaborated with a psychiatrist named Kenneth Apple. They did some really significant presentations and publications together, including this paper on using art therapy with individuals with schizophrenia. So Naumburg, she was really instrumental in establishing art therapy as its own profession. She organized exhibitions of patient artwork, advocated for it at conferences, and the American Art Therapy Association even recognized her with their very first honorary life membership in 1970.
That's huge.
Yeah, so she's like a major figure in the history of art therapy. But even as the field was forming, there were different ideas about what it was and how it should work, like Harriet Wadeson. She argued that art therapy wasn't tied exclusively to psychoanalysis, which was a big part of Naumburg's approach.
So even from the beginning, there was some debate.
Oh, yeah, totally. And that's actually something that continues to this day.
I see.
Like Dr. Nucho in her book, she talks about several different varieties of art therapy. One she describes as the art wing.
The art wing, okay.
And therapists who align with this, they usually have a strong background in fine arts. And they really emphasize the power of the art-making process itself as being therapeutic.
So it was about the act of creating.
Exactly. So in their sessions, they might include actual art instruction, focus on the aesthetic qualities of the artwork, and even exhibit their clients' creations. The art itself is really important in this approach.
So the focus there is really on that artistic product and its power to heal.
Yes. And then there's psychoanalytically oriented art therapy. And this one's heavily influenced by those Freudian ideas about the unconscious, those basic drives, and the whole idea of primary and secondary process thought. They see visual expression as this direct link to the unconscious.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like Freud himself noted how thinking in images, it actually predates thinking in words, both in how we develop as individuals and in human history as a whole.
Huh.
Naumburg, she believed that a lot of those unconscious thoughts and feelings, they come out more easily in images than they do in words.
So the artwork becomes like a window into that hidden part of the mind.
Exactly. Now, the psychocybernetic model, it recognizes that visual thinking is important, but it often uses Langer's terms, discursive and non-discursive thought, instead of primary and secondary.
Why is that?
Well, it's to avoid the implication that one type of thinking is less developed than the other.
Right.
It emphasizes that both ways of thinking are crucial for really understanding ourselves.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about some of those other approaches to art therapy?
Oh, there are a few. So you've got Jungian art therapy, which is a pretty big one. And in this approach, the therapist is more focused on creating a safe space, providing the materials, and just encouraging the client to express themselves freely. The goal is to help the client connect their conscious mind with their unconscious mind for personal growth.
Sounds very Jungian.
It is. Stephanie Lydiot described it as facilitating the individual's link with the activity of the mind below the surface of consciousness.
I like that.
Yeah, me too. And a key concept here is active imagination, which is intentionally engaging with those inner images without judgment or trying to control them.
Just letting them flow.
Exactly. Now, some Jungian therapists have experimented with using specific images related to those Jungian archetypes. But the main idea is that it's the spontaneous images, the ones that just emerge naturally, that have the most potential for healing. And this is because they represent a connection with the collective unconscious.
Okay, so it's less about guiding the process and more about letting it unfold organically.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And sometimes they integrate Dorokoff's sandplay method as well. It's interesting. Jungian psychology actually became popular in Europe earlier than in the US, but it's definitely had a growing influence on American art therapy.
So it's crossing borders.
It is. And then there's Gestalt art therapy. This one's largely based on Fritz Perls's Gestalt therapy, and it kind of aligns with that art wing approach we talked about earlier.
Okay.
It tends to work well with people who are overly controlled, inhibited, those struggling with things like phobias or depression. But it's generally not as effective for people with more severe mental health challenges, who might need more structured and reality-based approaches.
So it's about finding the right approach for the individual and their needs.
Absolutely.
All right, so now let's bring it back to the psychocybernetic model itself.
Yeah.
How does it actually play out in therapy? Like, what's the process like for the client?
Okay, so the psychocybernetic model outlines a process with 4 main phases: unfreezing, doing, dialoguing, and closure.
Okay, 4 phases.
Right. So let's start with unfreezing.
What is that, like thawing out?
Sort of. The unfreezing phase is all about helping the client get comfortable,
Yeah.
overcoming any anxiety they might have about making art.
Right, because a lot of adults haven't done art since they were kids.
Exactly. And they might feel self-conscious, or they might think they can't draw. So the therapist's job is to create a really safe and encouraging atmosphere.
Make them feel at ease.
Exactly. And they might use different techniques, like just inviting the client to play around with the materials,
Right.
or demonstrating some basic techniques like how to blend pastels, or even doing some gentle physical warm-up exercises like Kane suggests.
Oh, interesting.
It can help release tension, both physically and mentally, and it can actually stimulate those mental images. There's this really sweet story in the book about a group of older adults who were hesitant to try art at first,
Ah.
but they got so excited after seeing the therapist just engaging with the materials herself.
So leading by example.
Totally. And even those accidental marks or those spontaneous creations, they can be a starting point.
Like happy accidents.
Yeah. Like, there's an example of a client with a brain injury who, out of nowhere, drew something that looked like a cow.
Wow.
And another technique is Kane's free flow drawing, where clients make these abstract scribbles and then they look for recognizable shapes within those lines.
Oh, I've done that before.
And it's amazing what can come out of that.
It is.
Like, sometimes it reveals hidden aspirations or concerns that the person wasn't even consciously aware of.
So their subconscious is speaking through the art.
Right. And it's really helpful for people who feel like they're not artistic because there's no pressure to make a perfect picture. But it can also really spark the imagination of those who are more artistically inclined. And there are variations, like doing the scribbles with your eyes open or closed. And it can be used at different stages of therapy.
Versatile.
Totally. And we even see examples of those free flow drawings and how they were interpreted in the book. Like a drawing called a cat, but it actually looked more like a sphinx and it seemed to express grief. Or a drawing of a turtle or a snail, which represented a slow but steady journey of recovery.
That's so cool how you can find those meanings in something that seems so abstract.
Right. And sometimes projective drawing techniques like the Warteg test, the house tree person drawing, or the kinetic family drawing might be introduced during this phase as well.
So it's all about gently bringing the client into the process
Yeah.
and letting go of those fears and anxieties.
Exactly.
What about the next phase, the doing phase?
Okay, so in the doing phase, the therapist's main role is to make sure the art supplies are easy to get to and to kind of set the stage for the session.
Right.
They might suggest a general theme or just let the client choose freely what they want to create.
Freedom of choice.
Yeah, exactly. And once the client starts working, the therapist becomes like this unobtrusive observer, only stepping in if there are any distractions or anything. The emphasis in this phase is on spontaneous and pretty quick work without the client getting too caught up in the final product or how it looks.
So not worrying about being perfect.
Right. It's about encouraging what's called primary creativity, which is that free flow of ideas and images, not secondary creativity, which is more about refining and technique. And this phase can be really absorbing for clients, so it's important for the therapist to not interrupt that flow.
I can see how that would be important.
It is. And the length of this phase can actually vary depending on the client, whether they're a child, adolescent, or adult. The book even has a chart about it. And there's a really touching example of art therapy being used with a 96-year-old blind man who used clay to explore his memories and reflect on his life.
That's amazing.
It is. And a question that often comes up is whether the therapist themselves needs to be like a trained artist.
Right. Do they need to be super skilled?
Well, the Psychocybernetic model actually says that specific art training for the therapist isn't necessary.
Oh, interesting.
In fact, a therapist without extensive art training might actually find it easier to adopt what's called an ipsomatic approach, which we'll get into a bit later. But it basically means focusing on the client's own experience and interpretation of their art, not trying to impose any outside theories.
So it's more about the client's process than the therapist's expertise.
Exactly. The goal is to encourage the client's primary creativity, not to teach them to be an artist. Of course, having professional preparation and ongoing supervision is still super important, and especially when working with clients who might be related to professional artists.
Right.
It's important to make that distinction between the client's spontaneous creativity and that more technical, trained kind of creativity.
Okay, so in this phase, the therapist steps back and lets the client's inner world come out through their art.
Yes, exactly.
And what happens after the artwork is done?
That brings us to the dialoguing phase. This is where the magic really starts to happen.
Okay, tell me more.
So the dialoguing phase, this is where that visual language the client expressed in their artwork starts to connect with words.
Okay.
The goal is to help the client figure out the meaning behind their creation, what Jung called a cryptogram, like a hidden message.
Oh, cool.
Right. And the psychocybernetic model, it really emphasizes this ipsomatic approach during this phase.
We talked about that a little bit.
Right. It means that the interpretation of the artwork should come from the client, their own understanding of what they created, not from any predetermined theories or the therapist's own ideas.
So it's the client's meaning, not the therapist's.
Exactly. And there are four main parts to this dialogue process. First, there's the dialogue between the client as the artist and their artwork itself.
Oh, okay.
Then there's the discussion between the client and the therapist, which is guided by those ipsomatic principles.
Right.
And then there's the therapist's own internal reflections on the process, which they use to inform their approach.
Okay.
And finally, if it's a group therapy setting, there's a dialogue where the artist is still considered the primary interpreter of their work's meaning, even though others might share their responses.
So it's still centered on the artist's perspective.
Always.
Hmm.
And the actual dialogue process, it usually involves several steps.
Okay.
First, there's creating some distance from the artwork so you can look at it more objectively.
Put that back a bit.
Yeah. And then there's making an inventory of all the objects, colors, and shapes that are in the artwork.
Like describing what you see.
Exactly. Then there's identifying the emotions that the image evokes.
The feelings.
Yeah. And then exploring the thoughts and associations that are connected to it. And finally, consolidation and closure. And this is about reflecting on the whole process, accepting the artwork as it is, and understanding how the process unfolded.
So it's a journey.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the book actually has a visual representation of these steps. There's this great example of this process in the case of Jennifer and her outside picture. And you see how the therapist guides Jennifer's exploration of her drawing just by asking these open-ended questions.
Oh, that's interesting.
It is. And it's really important to make that distinction between what's called dispositional understanding, which is when the therapist imposes their own interpretation, and facilitative understanding, which is what we're talking about, where the therapist helps the client find their own meaning. And Jung's concept of amplification comes in here too, differentiating between a more objective, universal understanding of symbols and the client's own personal subjective associations. And then in group therapy, a key principle is that only the artist really knows the meaning of their art.
Right.
Other people's reactions, they're just their own personal responses, not the definitive interpretation.
Makes sense. So the therapist's role is really to guide the client to their own understanding.
Exactly.
And then what about the final phase, the closure phase?
Okay, so closure. It's about wrapping up the therapy and helping the client integrate all those insights they've gained throughout the process. So this involves setting a clear end date for therapy and reviewing all the progress that's been made. And the therapist needs to be mindful of any resistance the client might have to ending therapy.
Right. Because it can be hard to say goodbye.
It can be. And so they might use different strategies, like reminding the client how many sessions are left or just acknowledging any feelings that come up around ending the therapy.
Validating their feelings.
Right. And reviewing progress, it can involve comparing the client's early artwork with their later pieces. There's a really cool example in the book of a 5-year-old boy whose drawings showed a huge shift over time.
Wow.
Yeah. And sometimes they'll have the client pick out which pieces of artwork were most meaningful to them and which were least meaningful and talk about why.
Interesting.
It is. And often the most meaningful pieces are the ones where the client really put their heart into it, even if the subject matter was tough.
Makes sense. So it's about really solidifying what they've learned and preparing to move forward.
Exactly. And the book actually goes into detail about how to apply the psychocybernetic model with different age groups.
Okay.
So let's start with children. What are some of the key things to keep in mind when working with kids?
Okay, so for children, the model really stresses how important it is to understand their environment, their whole world. And often it suggests starting with indirect treatment through the parents first, which is called the child guidance model.
Right, because kids are so influenced by their families.
Exactly. The idea is that if you can address any issues within the family system, it can really